and welcome back, everybody. I hope that the panelists for the third and final panel of today are present. I would like to introduce David Duindam, who will be moderating this session. And David is a colleague from our own university, University of Amsterdam, lecturing in literary and cultural analysis. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guido, and of course, thank you very much for your invitation to moderate this panel. Today's last panel, Contemporary Jewish Literature on Jewish Identity in the Netherlands and in France. It is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers, the last three for today. First of all, Yolande Jansen. She moderated the first session, and of course last week she also interviewed Arnon Grunberg, so she is heavily involved in this whole conference. And she is the Associate Professor of Social and Political Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Amsterdam, board member of the Amsterdam Center of Globalization Studies, and special professor of the Socrates Foundation at the Vuisje University, where she holds the chair for humanism in relation to religion and secularity. Her work on Marcel Proust reflects on the contemporary position of European religious minorities, and Muslims in particular, in the context of debates about secularism, assimilation, integration, and multiculturalism. Then our second speaker is Remco Ensel, who is assistant professor at the Department of History, Art History and Classics at the Radboud University. He publishes and is involved in the debate on the Holocaust, post-war commemoration of World War II, and post-war anti-Semitism. In addition, he investigates Dutch nationalism on the basis of how Dutchness is captured in images, especially in photography. A new research focuses on the Jew as a stereotype on stage and on Jews as actors in the performing arts. And lastly, Ira van Dijk, who is full professor of Dutch literature in a global perspective at Leiden University. She focuses on the relationship between literature, memory, and media, and is currently working on a project to analyze Dutch Caribbean narratives in a comparative and cross-media perspective. In 2018, she published a critically acclaimed monograph on the oeuvre of German-Dutch author Arnon Grunberg in the light of Shoah memory and trauma of the second generation. So, Yolande, please, the floor is yours.
I'm going to try to stick to 5 minutes, so we have a lot of time to talk. But I do have a presentation with some quotes. The title of my article proposal, but I'm still thinking about how I should do this and what exactly the plan should be, is remembering the Semite in the European Islam-Judaism constellation. And what I would like to do in my article is reflect on something that Israeli-American scholar Gil Hochberg has called Remembering Semitism, which she has introduced in 2016, and she's written more about it, more from a Israeli Jewish, Arab Jewish perspective. And she writes this article, and it's very much about Europe, and it's about how Europe has played a role in constructing the Semites in 19th century literature and also scholarly work, in close connection to what Goani Jar has written about it, but also Maurice Hollandais much earlier in the history of philology, and how they reconstructed the emergence of this figure. And she says how this figure has been constructed in European culture and society, and how this could play a role in rethinking and questioning ways in which today relations between Jews and Muslims are presented as problematic by themselves as a binary, while there's a huge role played by the legacy of these European discourses, and especially this figure of the Semites. So that's why she says, what would it mean for us to seriously rethink and question the alignment between Judeo and Christian, and thus to oppose the current separation and growing hostility between Jews and Arabs Muslims, whose affinity was once marked by the term Semite? And then she says, what is needed is a playful rejuvenation of a particular discourse of history, a European discourse of history to be sure, and one that has long been responsible for positioning both Jews and Muslims alike as other and lesser to Western European Christian civilization. So it's also about the positioning of Jewishness there in a changing political context. And a different formulated question, but very closely related to Hochberg's, I think, is formulated by Miriam Leonard, who has a chair in 19th century reception of antiquity. And she formulates questions like that in the conclusion to her book, Socrates and the Jews, Hellenism and Hebraism, from Moses Mendelssohn to Sigmund Freud. If we have truly entered a secular age, if we have really escaped from the shadow of the Aryan and the Semite, if we live moreover in a globalized world with an infinite number of possible identifications, how are we to understand the compulsive recurrence of the polarity? And this is not a way to formulate maybe a similar kind of problematic. So that's what I would like to address. And I would like to do so through the work, looking at the work of two authors and how they do that. Two French authors, contemporary, with huge oeuvres, but not so well known outside of France. One is Denis Guénoun. Two books of him have been translated into English, about Europe, Philosophical Hypothesis, which is very much about the role of the definitions of and the history of idea of the Orient in relation to Europe, and how this notion came into being, and Semite, which is a memory of his father, and also the history of the French or the Aryan Jews. And the second one is Jean-Christophe Attias, he's a medievalist, but he's a novelist too, doing very, very interesting work. And he has a specific formulation in a book which is called Les Grecs, les Arabes et nous, Enquête sur l'islamophobie savante, where he very closely relates Islam and Judaism in European medieval history, and refers to that to criticize a contemporary view of Europe, which concentrates on Europe's Greek roots when reconstructing Christianity. By Sylvain Gouguenheim. So it's also a reaction to like a more populist, but also a reconstruction of Europe, where the contribution of both Judaism and Islam is not acknowledged, not in a positive way. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but Attias says two things I think which are important. On the one hand, Europe is characterized not by its identity, but by its incertitude, its porosity, its permeability, the cultural transfer, and he refers to the a specific role that Jews have played in this history, and then he refers also to the two languages, where he says deux idiomes à la fois, Indo-European et Semitique. So in the European languages and Semitic, Yiddish and Judeo-Espanol, so Ladino, and he says there, Gouguenheim is not talking about this whole history, because if he would not only have to acknowledge the position of the Jews in Europe, but also of Muslims and of Islam. And that is why it's not being talked about. And that's, I think, a way to remember the Semite within Europe in a way that also, well, my question will be, will it in some way circumvent, or how does it deal with the very problematic history of this concept and of its 19th century construction. How does this work? And the second, so the plan for my article, do I still have time? Okay, so the idea is to analyze how Attias and Guénoun relate to the 19th century figure of the Semite, which they invoke themselves, and to its rememory today, with reference to how Hochberg and Leonard problematized that history and also want to rejuvenate it. And what does this mean to the Judaism, Islam, Europe constellation, or how can we construct that? And then the specific question I would like to ask is, like, if you look at the modernist European literature, there was of course a huge number of irony protests against this polarity that Leonard is talking about. And there's a whole history of figures where hyphens have been tried out, but also with never as identities, but always with some irony or some twist to them and problematization as well, such as the Jew Greek, étrange juif, juif femme in Sixou, the Judaism as a literary genre. So what do all these ironic dimensions or ironic or problematizing or questioning dimensions of interrelations, how do they complicate this project of remembering the Semite? That would be, I think, my the central question for my article. And I would really like to have your comments about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Yolande. Thank you. Well, let's go to Remco before we get to the discussion. Remco.
Thank you. So a couple of years ago, I began to read the work of Robert Vuisje, and I wrote something about his work, and then I put it aside. And well, this year I picked it up again. So for this conference, actually. So I'm still continuing to read, but I will give a brief introduction of my reading of his work. So in 2008, Robert Vuisje surprised with a fictional coming-of-age novel of a young Jewish boy in the 80s Amsterdam. Alleen maar nette mensen, only decent people, or folks. And it was critically acclaimed, but also criticized. It was a commercial success, and a film adaptation soon followed. It elicited a lot of public debate about the portrayal of the characters, stereotypes used, and also the rather plain, perhaps unliterary language. But it became a bestseller all the same. And then Vuisje published two more novels, which closely followed the theme and the literary style of the first novel, albeit without gaining the same success and public attention. The author at that time was already professionally active as a journalist, and he continued to do so. And it was the novel, the first novel, that launched him at the same time as a kind of public voice, an enduring public voice, as to now, in the public debate about racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnicity in Dutch society. So, for instance, he also did gain some critical acclaim with a series of interviews about the national and ancestral identities or ethnicities of the interviewees, which have recently been published in one volume, these interviews. He joined talk shows, gave a much publicized keynote speech in honor of the Surinamese Dutch intellectual and resistance fighter Anton de Kom. So his novels, as well as his contributions to public debate, probe the current status of Jews and Jewishness in Dutch society, I believe. So I read these books as a kind of micro-fictional ethnographies, for which to, let's say, maintain the analogy with ethnography, we then should start from the moment that ethnographers more emphatically included their own persona into their work, which I believe Vuisje also follows the same strategy. I furthermore see his work as a kind of attempt to reinscribe Jews and Jewishness into the post-racial innocence phase of Dutch literary and public debate. That is the phase which lays beyond us, I believe, in which the performance of not noticing and not thinking and forgetting of race was central. And secondly, as a kind of literary search for a viable mode of understanding, and perhaps also a claim for an empathy of sorts. So his novels and his other work particularly center the Jewish presence in an urban environment. So I would argue he thereby harks back to two, you might say, literary traditions. The first, I would mention the ghetto literature. Arguably, I guess I need to do more research on that, but for now, I think his novels can be read as a kind of reinvention of ghetto literature that emerged at the end of the 19th century, and in which it is central a Jewish community as a kind of ambivalent urban community, seen as one, but at the same time literally internally divided, and at the same time existing in a strange and sometimes even hostile environment. And the second literary tradition would be the Chicago School of Sociology, which was pre-war and which tried to explore this emergent, urban, ethnically diverse, migratory society using qualitative methods and also simultaneously using fiction and non-fiction. And I think that can also be seen in his work in the fictional and non-fictional, the public, private transgressions that are part of Vuisje's work, as also in his thematic development of his, which follows closely the cycle of coming of age, child, parenthood, and also his professional and marital career, so to speak. So in all cases, to sum it up, we see we are dealing with a kind of perspective in which there's this coming of age or aging man from an urban middle class Jewish family with an obvious Holocaust past, who is confronted with a modern society in which this ethnicity is increasingly problematized, but which this problematization is not expressed in terms of attention and respect for Jews as victims or even as a separate ethnicity. So not identity politics or Black and anti-racist projects create room for a Jewish perspective. And nor does it recognize that Jews are kind of knowledge specialists of violent social exclusion. On the contrary, Jews are, as I put it in the abstract, are reclassified as the white establishment, disenfranchised to speak out in terms of, in matters of discrimination, ethnic violence, and victimhood. Or so that is how I believe Vuisje puts it in his fiction and non-fiction text. So this probing, this microhistory of or ethnography evolves into an exploration of this public presence of Jews in a changing field of urban life, brimming with ethnic markers, in which it's very easy to make a faux pas, as it were. So I think his work can also be read as an attempt to map this symbolic system of urban ethnicity with a great emphasis on the body, physicality, and materiality. So then if there's a taboo breaking aspect to his work, at least that's how I remember when I read his first novel, and I had this impression myself, I felt it more or less. It lies in showing this enduring, the enduring meaning and importance of ethnicity in society that sees itself as modern and enlightened. So being urban in his novels means being able to read the cultural codes that are associated with the body, skin color, hairstyle, personal names, language, and attributes like clothing, car brand, and also spatial movement. So it means being streetwise. So to conclude, I watched part of the Arnon Grunberg interview, not all, fortunately, but I read the part which dealt with the play and with the playfulness, which was very interesting. And I think it referred, or Grunberg referred to the work of Vuisje Meyer and the way in which Meyer mentioned this playfulness. And I think it was very much addressed at the time within the perspective of theater, the Fassbinder affair, this self-abduction of Jules Grasset, but also the plays by Judith Hertzberg, and I tend to think also Anne Frank play, which at the same time. So the playfulness and the possibility of playing a part. And I think the work of Vuisje shows or tries to make clear that the homo ludens, as it were, is a kind of privileged person. It's not everyone is free to take on a role. Some are given a role, some are typecast, some are pigeonholed. So playing with your identity, for instance, did not help Jews, not even those that were playful with their own Jewishness. And I think that his work tries to make that clear. But at the same time, this is my final sentence then, at the same time, it's precisely Robert Vuisje, of course, who shows and presents all this in a very playful manner through literature. So it's then in the domain of arts in which we, you can actually show the playfulness in which, identities can be construed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remco. Ira.
Thank you. I do have a PowerPoint as well to share, but I'll keep it short. Let's see if I can manage. So a lot that I would like to say about Arnon Grunberg is indeed similar to what Vuisje is doing. So I'll zoom in especially into the things that are different from what Vuisje is doing. Let me see if I can, yeah. So Arnon Grunberg, he's more or less the same generation. He was born in 1971, just a little bit younger than Vuisje, I think. And he developed very quickly from coming into the literary scene as a rebel to eventually acting as a moral voice in the Dutch literary landscape, but also in the memorial landscape. So the picture on the right is taken last year at the May 4th Remembrance ceremony in the church, which was empty for Corona reasons, obviously. I'll talk about his lecture later. I mentioned it briefly in my abstract, which was very short. It was a really misunderstanding. It was not that I had no more than 8 lines to say about Arnon Grunberg. But I understood the question wrong, because there's actually quite a bit to say about that, but I'll try to do it in 5 minutes. Because his morality or his ethics are extremely ambivalent and complicated. So for the international listeners, the people from the Netherlands will undoubtedly all know Grunberg. A very quick introduction. He wrote already about 15 novels. He wrote every day on the front page of the national newspaper, the Volkskrant, these little footnotes as they're called. And he writes essays and journalistic reports in the newspaper. So he's very active and public writer. And in his journalistic ventures, he goes embedded in the Dutch or the German or the American army, for example. It's been a while now since he's done that, but he went to Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. So he really tries to find places in which he can discover what war means and what conflict means, and especially what the conflict in the Middle East means today, and how he can talk about this as a writer, for example, on the front page of a newspaper, but not as a journalist, but as an author who well, tries to find a midway between these stances. And then again, we come into the play that Remco mentioned already, that I'll try to say a little bit about more. Also, what he's doing here, I think, when he goes to Iraq or Afghanistan, is acting as a witness. And in his writings about this, these are words that he often mentions as well. And in a way, he's also, I think, to make it a little bit biographical, he's also reenacting the witness that his parents were to the Holocaust. So he's going into dangerous situations in which he can feel the real life, as he calls it, and really feel that he's alive and that his life is maybe even threatened. So he's looking for danger in a kind of complicated reenactment, but also to understand what war actually means from the perspective of a witness, rather than as the second generation author that he is. So maybe to go back to very quickly to his background, his mother survived Auschwitz and other camps when she was 17, and his father was quite a bit older, and he survived in hiding in the Netherlands, and they married after the war, and they had 2 children. And actually his entire oeuvre is based upon this history of his mother, although thematically it's not always about the war. If you analyze it, in the end, it always turns out that this trauma is at the heart of the novels. So he puts himself very explicitly in a Jewish European cultural tradition. So all the writers that are mentioned in the introduction to the abstracts by David and Yolande, and even more, are referenced in his work. So he very explicitly, and I think that's different than, for example, what Vuisje does, very explicitly puts himself in that tradition, quotes these people, re-narrates them, ironizes them, impersonates them, even in the case of Philip Roth, digests them, or anthologizes them. So there's even a bit more than the names in the program, like Hertzberg or Margaminko, for example, Hilsenrath. What he doesn't reference are the Israeli writers who are more religious or more orthodox. And in addition to the Jewish European writers, he also referenced a lot of second generation writers. And he has a lot in common with, for example, Maxime Bieler. So in his interview by David and Yolande, he was asked what he sees in this European Jewish work. And he mentioned, as a common denominator, he mentioned the déracinement, the uprooting. I don't really like that word in English, but I couldn't find a better word. The uprooting, or diaspora would maybe be a better way, which allows for a position in the center of society where Jewish writers would be now, but in a way they are always reminiscent of the people or the positions in the margins, reminiscent of the others that are uprooted or that were never allowed to root in the first place. So that's what he sees as Jewish writing. And that's a much different moral position than we heard, for example, about Paul Celan, for example. What I do find similarity with what was said this morning about Paul Celan is that his Jewishness, in a way, is provoked by anti-Semitism. And I think that's what Remco more or less is saying about Robert Vuisje as well. So the change in context is making him more aware of his Jewishness and making him more explicit about that. And in that context too, it's important that he's extremely pro-Europe in his work. So the moral problem, the ambivalence at the heart of his work is that there's actually no, I'll move to the next slide, there's actually no ideological basis for his intellectual role. So he puts himself forward as a public intellectual, but he feels that there's no morale, that if you try to do something good, you might always end up to do the opposite, to do something wrong. So he's always deconstructing his own position as a public intellectual, because he says there's no, in the Europe that we live in right now, there's only, well, we cannot find a basis to find the good. And he's always, so his heroes, they are basically tragic people that are torn between different duties, the duty towards the society on the one hand and the duty towards their personal families on the other hand. So they're always tragic heroes that do wrong on both ends, and that if they try to do the right thing, they end up finding themselves on the wrong end of history, as for example in the novel called The Man Without Disease. So he's basically extremely ironic, even in his novels that appear to be serious. And the irony is the fact that there's no basis under it. So just to wrap up, how am I for time? Not very good, huh? Yeah, okay. He became more serious and less ironic in the later years. For example, in the two things that he performed on May 4th, on the commemoration day in the Netherlands. First was a play in 2018, in which he combined commemoration of the Second World War with Me Too, with a rape memory of a rape that happened 20 years ago, but which was perpetrated, which was done by somebody ironically called the Great Commemorator, an old man who raped this journalist 20 years ago. And in that play, there's only pain and guilt and trauma. But it seems in the end, there's a third generation character in there who might point towards some kind of a consolation when in the end of the play, she asks, "May I cry now?" So he seems to point towards maybe mourning instead of just trauma and reproach. But he ironically poses this public devotion of this commemorator to the fact that the Me Too victim is ignored and humiliated. And more famously, his last speech last year on May 4th was about remembering. And when he says remembering is to speak on behalf of the dead, there we have Paul Celan again, which is only possible by having the eyewitness speak. And then he created havoc by saying, "For me, it was clear from the beginning, if they speak about Moroccans, they are speaking about me." So he places himself in the position of, well, let's say the underdog, but it's also something that he's always done, to speak on behalf of those who suffer. And that's he's done in novels about the Middle East, but also about South America or about Africa. So he's taking a very strong intellectual and ethical position, and at the same time, all the time pointing towards that we never know, that we are never sure where the good may be found. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ira, and all speakers, of course. I was thinking myself about contemporary kind of call for intersectional approaches to societal issues. In other words, that people who are either suffering or in the margins of society or being structurally discriminated against should, in a sense, team up and work together towards justice that goes beyond that is institutional and structural, let's say. And I think that in all of your talks, this relationship between, let's say, Jewish identities and Muslim identities is at the core. Remco, in your abstract, you write, Jews are reclassified to the white establishment, disenfranchised to speak out in matters of discrimination, ethnic violence, and victimhood. I thought this was a really interesting quote. And then Arnon Grunberg himself said in the interview that Yolande and David Wertham had last week, when he was asked about the notion of the Jew as a metaphor in literature, he said, I think that the Jew as a figure is the eternal who is located in the center, but still carries the same periphery within him. So my question is, what are the limits of, you could say, this intersectional approach, or can you actually speak on behalf of the other? And if so, why would literature be the preferred mode of doing so? I'm not sure who would like to respond to this question first.
Well, maybe I may start the discussion by making clear, of course, that Robert Vuisje's work is permeated with the notion of intersectionality. I mean, his novels in particular all deal with this with this urban environment in which not only ethnicity but also class and gender intersect, and I would add the notion of generations as well. So this whole idea of looking for empathy or kind of asking for it as well in his work, but also looking for new forms of solidarity. I think that they're all at the heart of his work, and that also implies that he sees a problem with that, not only in society as a whole, but it also in his private life. I mean, what I find interesting in his work is that he very much tries to explore this intersectionality within his own family. He is from a he has a mixed marriages, black and white families, in which both sons have a different skin color. And as he says, that immediately implies that when I'm walking the streets with them, with one or the other, that they immediately, from the day they are able to walk the streets, develop a different experience and develop different forms of solidarity. And they develop a kind of loyalty and a kind of sense of belonging to which I cannot reach, and I'm closed off from that. And that's this. So there's this identification, there's this sense of collectiveness among Jews, but it's also changing at the same time from generation to generation, and which is even more problematized when you look at it from an intersectional perspective. So he doesn't give a solution to that, but I think it's a very, very interesting to see how that develops in his work.
If I can maybe add
Yes.
to that, yeah. That the interesting thing is that you can see that for Grunberg it's much more complicated actually, because he, in a way, he's so philosophical that he's also very aware of the fact that you cannot really speak on behalf of somebody else, so that there's always the distance and the fact that you cannot ever really understand the position of somebody else. So he tries to, and then at the same time, his characters always fall short of really being able to help or solidarity, show solidarity. So he's very skeptical in a way as well. And then there's the question of what literature can do, what the role of the writer is. So the novels are actually always self-referential, in fact that even if they seem to be about something completely different, they're always about literature and about writers and about the question what they can do. And that they fall short necessarily because they are writing instead of being out there in the world.
Well, this was also one of the questions I had with Yolande's contribution. It seems to me somewhere it was about, let's say, this looking for pure roots and placing those roots in a Greek tradition rather than this Jewish or Islamic tradition, versus this notion of contamination or cultural transfer. And then you ask this question about modernist literature. I was wondering how you would connect, let's say, this more historiographical debate between these historians, as I understand it, versus the literary novels that you speak about. So, how do you link those two in your work?
Maybe is it okay if I first react to what Remco and Ira were saying?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, because I was thinking about that, and then maybe afterwards I can, because I would like to bring up a question. You, Remco, you were saying like they are relocated or something, reclassified to the white establishment. That's what's happening in the
the public sphere.
In the public sphere. And I was wondering whether that's maybe partly a projection of what has happened in the US, where this has, I think this is a quite mainstream view that this is what has happened. And whether in the European context, you could also think of it a little bit differently, also in relation to what Grunberg was saying, like Jews are in the center, but carrying the periphery with them. Something that I think is one of the sources of inspiration even for Hofburg to talk about the Semite is this, that you saw this when Paul Cliteur was accused of having said anti-Semitic things, like the whole like cultural or there was an enormous cultural reaction. So from the white majority, while and I heard this reaction to everything that happened from several people. You can be Islamophobic publicly without ever being really contradicted in a comparable manner. Now you think that this is something which is just harmful to the Muslims, but the worry is of course also that it's also harmful to European Jews, or in the sense that it creates the perception of being the most beloved minority. And this is of course also something which has played an enormous role in anti-Semitism and in European anti-Semitism. So that's something I think that this reclassification, it's something really to take into also when thinking about like the limits of intersectionality. And I would think, well, I'm sorry, I have a phone ringing here, I'm sorry. It has to go, I'm sorry, excuse me. But so this in-between figure, rather than being member of the white establishment, really, that's something which is important to take into account very much, I think. And yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, I think just two things. First of all, of course, this in-between figure, the ambivalence of Jew, an urban Jew, a young boy in Amsterdam. Of course, that's the center of Vuisje's first novel, and it's exactly that he tries to find common ground with other ethnic minorities, in particular the Moroccans in Amsterdam. And I think he at the same time argues that they both, in a way, are are located, are situated in a very privileged position because of this ambivalent position. They are able to watch and see, look at the Dutch society from a privileged position. So that's one thing, of course. I think he tries to argue for that, but he
Are we having, did we lose connection?
I think so.
Okay. Shall I maybe?
Please, yeah.
Because I also saw a question in the chat that is related to this, I think, by Guido. How can you still be playful in this situation? I think maybe it connects to this. And I wanted to reference again quote Grunberg, who talked about Ernst im Spiel. He references Mann there. And I think that's what he would think that a writer should always do. And that's exactly what literature has to offer, or what art has to offer. And I think we shouldn't forget about that we are still speaking about literature and not just about racial or ethnic positions, but about writers that try to do this from a position of literature. And I think exactly that the Ernst has grown the last years in the situation that we have. But yeah.
Is that position of literature not also a position of privilege in a sense? I mean, the example that Remco gave was two young, I would imagine two young boys with a different skin color being interpolated or being looked at from a perspective that they have no influence about. They cannot say, well, let's be playful about these gazes on our bodies versus, let's say, the playfulness within literature or within art.
I think that's exactly why Grunberg would speak about Ernst im Spiel, why the game is so radically important, is because you have the responsibility vis-a-vis those people that cannot afford the games, and that are working in coal mines, or that are being discriminated or expelled or whatever. So that's where the Ernst comes in, I would propose. But that still you have the obligation to keep investigating the ground of morality beneath all of this, and that's what makes writers different from, for example, politicians, or maybe just populist politicians. That you have to keep investigating what you are basing your position on, I think. But so a writer also has the obligation to be aware of his privilege or her privilege. And that's why the self-referentiality is so important, I think. And it's quite extreme in Grunberg's work how much the protagonists have to give up. So that's why they're so tragic. They have to give up very much to be able to take that position. And they have to neglect the rest of their lives or their loved ones, or so it's quite a radically lonely position as well, this autonomy.
Remco, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I was out of the...
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm not a fiction author, but I would suppose that it is in literature that you not only try to say things about the other as the other, but also about yourself as the other. And again, this is which is very clear from Vuisje's view, that he also tries to explore his own otherness in his work, and his father, his uncles, his sons are in a way the aspects of himself as his self, and at the same time they are other, you know, in a generational sense. So I think it's exactly in literature that you create empathy not only by writing about some faraway other, but also by exploring the otherness that is very much part of yourself. I mean, I'm not saying anything new, of course, but
Yolande, do you want to respond to the question asked about well, the historical debate versus literary reflections on contamination, etc.? Is there a fundamental difference between these two realms?
I'm a little bit hesitating to say this playfulness could only happen in art or literature. It does there, of course, but maybe like what Hochberg is trying to do, and also I think some other authors too, also like Gil Anijar, is like introducing a kind of playfulness which has to do with which wants to deal with the hugely complicated and painful history of theory also, and of construction of the humanities, in a sort of reconstruction of what has happened. And there it goes, this playfulness goes into theoretical work too, very much. So I think in that sense, this and it you see like the awareness of playfulness, you see very much also in all kinds of activism, of course. So I think it's the cultural rethinking, analyzing dimension, which makes this possible. And we of course also know how illusory it is that it works, or that it's really has the impact it would like to have, of course. So I think that's also something that Grunberg is dealing with in his work. Like you see this very much, like, okay, where this what is the force in the end of this cultural history of playfulness in relation to politics when it goes its way. You see this worry very much also about what's happening in Europe and the US, I think, today. Also in the latter panel that we were talking about, like borders, how much playfulness about borders, about European borders, how much awareness is there in European cultural history of the porosity and the terribleness also of hard borders. And what do we have at the European borders? We have the same kind of, or same, like the force of, also the force of injustice and of accepting injustice as if it should just be there, it's normal or so. It's so enormous that that's also, I think, should be part of this question about literature or about humanities broadly.
So that's basically the problem, that in this situation, the playfulness or the irony or the self-referentiality of literature is under too much pressure because of this this need to correct this unevenness, and to correct this growing populism, and to correct this very dangerous situation in which the borders are hardening, and in which we seem to be going back into history rather than to be going forward. So that's what you see happening in Grunberg's work and his lectures and his interviews, that he's more and more aware of that problem. How to write about this still in a literary way, or how to keep literature alive in that situation, rather than just being, well, the knight that combats inequality. That's a very problematic position for the writer today, for the Jewish writer today, I think. And that's why, I think that's why Grunberg loves Coetzee so much, because he's always asking these questions as well. How can you in South Africa be a white writer and still be a literary writer and not just well, somebody who does moral research? That's the position that in, for example, Waiting for the Barbarians, Coetzee would always investigate, and where he shows that there's no innocent position wherever you are. There's no situation in which you are not complicit anymore, and that's the role of the writer, I think, to well, design characters in stories that demonstrate this lack of possibility to be innocent or to be not complicit, whatever you do. So that's what narrative can also do.
And that would not be particular to Jewish writers, I suppose, as the example of Coetzee shows, of course.
Well, what Grunberg also said in the interview last week is how his work also changed because the world around him changed, right? So there is this strong relationality there between worldly matters and his own work. And Guido Snell asked a question that he also expressed the wish to restore the grotesque in his own work. So on the one hand, he said, the grotesque is in my earlier work. You can see the grotesque that kind of disappeared, and now perhaps it should return. Do you think that, or this is the question Guido asks, does that mode of the grotesque still work in the present climate? I think that's an interesting question because it really is about this literary technique. And what does restore mean? Is it going back to, or is it a new version of the grotesque?
I'm really distracted by that cat.
Sorry?
No, it's really nice. It's it was not a complaint. It's just funny. I would say that at this time would need the grotesque more than ever, actually, and that we are lost if we would move into seriousness too much, because then also writers would be reduced to, well, let's say to ethical philosophers rather than to writers. We are losing track of the literary. That's really what I see all around me, that people, students, but everyone is losing the capacity also to give meaning to different forms. And that we are going into a more and more realist literature that's one-on-one on reality. And that way there's no space to really negotiate different realities. And I think that's maybe one of the problems. You really need a literature that's not so literal. So I think but I don't know what Guido would say, but we need the grotesque more than ever.
I would say not just the grotesque, but a sense of style, also very much in scholarly work. This is also to do with, but that's a little bit, it goes a bit away from the theme, but it's in a way it's also related, that the way we think what humanities work is and what it is doing, it's very important that we sort of like, I think as scholars, we recover an idea of scholarly style, but then also with literary dimensions. Mm. And that's something that we're not trained to do at all. And it's, that would also, like the critical spirit, depends very much on this possibility, I think. So that's, and that, yeah, in the end, it's relevant to the theme of our conference too.
Yeah, I think that was exactly the problem, of course, and the debate or the uproar about Vuisje's first novel, that it was not acknowledged to be this grotesque novel, as opposed to a kind of documentary on life in modern day Amsterdam. But at the same time, he by using all these different venues and different media and fiction, non-fiction, and I already mentioned this kind of sociological Chicago style way of writing, also provokes misunderstanding, if that would be a possibility. So, but that of course then makes it interesting. And I have to admit that at the time I was a bit disappointed that Vuisje just came up with this. He conjured up this idea of, this is the author and these are the characters. I think, okay, that we already know that, but try to make it more interesting to discuss what it is that you exactly are trying to do. But yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think that there's enough to say, but our time is up. So thank you, Yolande, Dijk, and Remco. And thank you all participating and listening in. And I give the floor back to David Wertheim.
Yes, just to thank you all the panelists and all the moderators again for this wonderful afternoon. In which I think many topics were discussed throughout the whole period, post-war period, and even before. And we ended today just now with some remarks of our present age. And I think it goes to show that if you talk about literature, you talk about everything, because literature is basically about everything. So many thanks, and tomorrow we have another afternoon, so I hope to see you. Well, I wish I could say I hope to see you all tomorrow at 1, but I hope everybody will see the panelists again tomorrow at 1. So goodbye, and have a good evening, and see you tomorrow.